Hello, and welcome to, well, what is one of the more interesting little ships that can be discussed in this series because it's often one that gets forgotten by people, yet it tells us so much about the reality of the world as it was then. And what am I talking about? I'm talking about the Gefion of 1893. Now, the Gefion is interesting because it is an unprotected, unarmored cruiser produced for the Kaiserlich Marine, which is kind of strange because it's produced in the 1890s when theoretically they are building up to match the British. Or rather, beginning their build up to match the British. They're beginning their build up of a navy of status. Yes, Tirpitz hasn't risen to power. Yes, they're still getting going, but they are there. The seeds have been laid. There is a Kaiser on the throne who is obsessed with building a navy. Everything is starting to head that way, and yet here they are building an unprotected cruiser. And the question is why? You see, if you're Britain, your reason of building unprotected cruisers is to provide the mass, the volume of vessels you need to have your presence around the world. In this period, they're basically akin to sloops. In fact, quite a few of them probably would be classified as sloops if you were talking about another period of time. But the Germans, well, they have some pockets of empire, but not really massive. And they're an industrializing nation. They have this reputation of industry, of capability, of capacity. Surely, surely they can afford to. And what's more, this vessel is going to prove its utility as a status vessel over and over again. And when I say utility as a status vessel, it's used as a status vessel. It's not designed to be a status vessel, but it's certainly used as one. Which makes it all even more boggling. That this ship, pictured in 1894, is what they build. The Gefion is not particularly anything. In fact, it's almost particularly nothing. It is capable of 19.5 knots, so it's not fast. It is capable of 3,500 nautical miles at 12 knots, so it's not particularly long ranged. It does have 25 millimeters of deck armor, but that is akin to nothing. And still gets it classified as an unprotected, unarmored cruiser, despite it having the 25 millimeters of deck armor. In 1894, everyone looks at that and goes, cute. Cute. Like that. Ten 105mm guns, or 4.1 inch. Six 50mm guns. Two 450mm torpedo tubes. That's it. That's their great weaponry. That's their great firepower. What is this ship? What is this ship? It's 110 meters long. It's 13.2 meters wide. It's got a draft of 6.47 meters. It overall displaces 4,275 tons. One wonders what all that weight is spent upon. In reality, this ship is a symptom of what was already the case of Germany. They had a lot of ambition, a lot of statements, a lot of interest, but not really a lot of long term thinking or investment. This is one of the troubles. Germany has the Kaiser, the first Wilhelm, does very well. He has Bismarck, who does very good things in terms of long term thinking. When his son takes over, he doesn't have the same mold as his father, produces many children, but looks like he has some long term thinking, but unfortunately dies quite young. Then Wilhelm takes over. Wilhelm not only doesn't have long term thinking, there is a small trouble. The person who fostered his arrogance in some respect, his desires, and supported him and encouraged him to be more belligerent where his father was concerned, the Wilhelm I and Bismarck. Well, Wilhelm I is dead, and Bismarck finds himself dismissed because Kaiser Wilhelm's second ego will not tolerate someone else in the room who is not only smarter but knows it and shows it. He can't deal with that. If you want to have a navy today, it's too late. Navies are all about long term investment. I'm often asked to question, why does the Royal Navy of the 19th century achieve such dominance? Most people usually phrase around of, is it really Trafalgar? Or why did Trafalgar give the Royal Navy dominance for 100 and something years? And I usually turn around to them and say, it didn't. What gave the Royal Navy dominance for roughly 100 and, let's be charitable, 40 odd years after Trafalgar was investment in infrastructure. This is the details of the Kaiserlich Marine. SMS, Seine Majestät Schiff, His Majesty's ship. They also have His Majesty's yacht, Her Majesty's yacht, His Majesty's light vessel, auxiliary ship, workshop, submarine, or of course it could be Seine Majestät Kina Kiliza Emden, i.e., His Majesty's light cruiser Emden. Lovely. It was, of course, drawn from the Royal Navy, His Majesty's ship, HMS, or Her Majesty's ship as it was up until a few days ago. And there's the problem. The Royal Navy have been funded, by this point, by a government egged on by trading classes since time of Charles I, ship money. And then Parliament took it over. And then Charles II continued it because Parliament continued it. And whilst the army was the king's plaything, Parliament took the lead when it was funding the navy, because the navy was important to commerce, the navy was important to trade, the navy was important to insurance and banking and all the things which made the UK rich. So Parliament took the lead in funding. And that meant the Navy had long term funding. It wasn't something which suddenly went up, it was something which was able to build upon year after year after year after year after year after year. The Royal Navy achieves the dominance it does not through a wooden wall, because let's be honest, a wooden wall starts to erode and disappear in comparison to other people's constructed wooden walls very quickly after 1805. Look at the fun they have in 1812 when everything starts off again and they have the A fleet deal in Europe and most of the B fleet, and they have the C and D fleet scrabbling to deal with America. That's the Royal Navy caught on the hop 7 years later. But the fact is, they do it. Gefion is, of course, named for a Norse goddess of farming, virginity, all sorts of things, really. She's a rather interesting goddess. When I was looking her up, it was sort of, hmm, there is a lot of knowledge there here. And she was also supposed to have foreknowledge, which seemed to me an interesting choice and something which I thought they selected her for, because this is a ship which was supposed to at some point be able to do a reconnaissance role. I'm not quite sure when they thought that'd be viable, but with a speed of only 19.5 knots and a range of 3,500 nautical miles, but it's nice to know. Getting back to the point though, the Royal Navy had been invested in for a long time. Why does the Royal Navy manage to maintain its lead when it becomes an age of iron and steel and industry? Because of investment. There are other nations you would expect a war or at least a semi-peaceful, a semi-contested transition to take place in the 19th century. You would expect the other industrializing powers to mobilize up and be strong. There are huge economies which should be industrializing and should be strong enough to combat the British. The Americans, after the Civil War, should be now a major power. I know I don't agree with Rick Rover's assessment, which comes from the Columbia class video, which was the previous video to this one in this series, that the US Navy was the largest or the most powerful navy in the world at the end of the Civil War. They weren't, but they should have been able to parlay their advances, their strength, the foundations they built in that war to being contender for that, but they don't. In fact, they consistently don't. The US has great shipyards. They have greatly capable engineers. They have a wonderful economic system in terms of growth at this time. Everything seems to be on the up and up. And yet it doesn't transpire that they are investing in the infrastructure in the Navy that would go with that status and that would allow them to challenge Britain. It doesn't happen. They're not challenging Britain because they can't challenge Britain. It's even worse when you're Germany. Germany doesn't have the luxury America does of its neighbors being mostly tiny and not having that many troops. Yes, we could say the Americans had a nasty surprise in 1812 when they went north of the border. But as a rule, the Americans don't have much of a contest around them on land, whereas the Germans do. So the army gets a tremendously large amount of investment in Germany. They are the primus inter pares, but that's suggesting that in any way the Kaiserlich Marine will be equal. They won't. They won't get the funding. So that means the German Navy, in whatever name it's called, has to look capable, has to pursue ships which give it an apparent capability, but don't cost that much. Now, if you look at this, you can soon figure out where the 650mm guns are. They are here, waist, and right at the stern. You can also figure out where the 10 105mm guns are. Now, originally, this vessel had been going to be better armed. Originally, they'd hoped to carry more weapons. Unfortunately, life doesn't always work out that way. They're supposed to carry 5.9-inch guns, 150mm guns. But then the battery was revised down to 15 10.5-inch guns, or 10.5 centimeters, 105mm. Sorry. I should not be recording at 1:20 hours in the morning. Apologies. But the other version I've got of this is absolutely terrible sound-wise every time I upload it. I have no idea why. So instead, they had 10 105mm guns, all due to weight and cost. They carried a total of 807 rounds of ammunition for these guns, and these guns had a maximum range of 10,800 meters. But let's be honest, you are probably looking at a viable engagement range of about 5,000 meters. The vessel was built by a very capable yard, Shadowwerk, which was based in Danzig. And Elbing. I think Danzig, of course, is now modern Gdansk. I think she was built in the Danzig yard, but I'm not 100% sure. I could be misreading it. This was a yard which had been going for a long time. They were founded in 1837. They went defunct in January 1945. They were also a company which built a lot of trains. And yeah, there are successor companies still going, I think, until 2009. But this company itself wasn't able to build ships for that long. They built the SMS Gefion, the Wessex class battleship, the Braunschweig class battleships LS and Lorringen, Helgoland class battleship Oldberg, Kaiser class battleship König Albert, and the Bayern class battleship Baden. plus the Lutzow and the Grass Bay. That is the Mackensen class battlecruiser Grass Bay. Lots and lots and lots of torpedo boats, U-boats, and pretty much everything else you would expect. They were a very good yard to pick. But also, you'd expect them to be able to, the sort of yard to be given a bigger challenge than something which has 25 millimeters worth of armor. Let's be honest. That's going to protect maybe against penetration in terms of the explosion, not a shell. If the shell actually hits it from anything approaching an equivalent gun to what she's fitted with, it's going through. But probably it can contain the explosion above that deck. So it's kind of like having an armored strength deck. Anyway, what's she often used for? Well, she often goes out escorting the SMY Hoselhan II. Now, this, of course, is the second of the Royal Yachts. And yes, Sena Majesty Yacht. I don't know. An interesting ship. An interesting ship carrying an interesting soul who was special. Now, she actually spent quite a lot of time escorting them. It was 1895 when she spent really long time with Kaiser, with Wilhelm. She does the opening of the Kaiser Wilhelm Canal, and it's July 1895. She escorts him to visit King of Sweden and takes a trip to the Cowes Regatta. When they returned to Wilhelmshaven on 7th of August, she participated in the annual fleet or annual autumn fleet maneuvers. She is not that great, but she does her role. And after the fleet maneuvers, she goes back to escorting Holzheim. Now, the thing was, I've pointed out her cruising radius, which isn't that large. But it was the highest of all the German ships available at the time. That's an advantage, right? Well, that is a problem. You see, the reason I'm a bit disdainful of it, if it's supposed to be a commerce interdiction vessel or commerce raider, is that who are you fighting with it? If you're fighting France, well, the bulk of their trade and the bulk of their ports are on their Atlantic coast, which are not that far away from you. If you're going into the Mediterranean, that means you're going to need base and support to operate down there, because otherwise you're going to have a glass jaw scenario. And range of 3,500 nautical miles sounds great, but if you're thinking of going from Germany, probably not down the English Channel, to the Mediterranean, to interdict trade down there, you've got a frigating long journey, and you're not going to be able to be down there for that long. Unless you can meet up with an ally. You need longer range. You need a longer range vessel. She's long ranged, but she's long range in comparison to German units, not in comparison to what their role they're asking her to do. She spends a lot of time with the Halzern, but eventually she gets assigned to the East Asia Squadron. Now, she gets specifically assigned to the 2nd Division of the East Asia Squadron. Why? because by the time she's assigned to it, which is 1897, sorry, I needed to expand the screen so I could read the notes. I do apologize. By the time she gets deployed to the East Asia Squadron, she is already starting to prove problematic. In fact, the Kaiserlich Marine is already starting on a class of what will eventually be light cruisers that will succeed her and replace her in pretty much every one of her roles because they're looking at her and going, this this doesn't appear to be working. Again, why doesn't it work? Well, think about it. Think about her tasks. Think about what the Kaiserlich Marine in strategic situation is asking of her. This is the problem with unprotected cruisers. They offer theoretically numbers, but for that to be useful, you'd have to build a lot of these. Building a single ship is not really any help. Building a dozen of these vessels, okay, that then becomes something which can be problematic to deal with. You build one and it's not got survivability, then you're basically sending someone out a long way before they die. Now, in 1897, there were a lot of issues going on in the Far East. But more importantly for the Germans, they were seeking to strengthen their position out there. They were seeking to strengthen their position massively. And so they formed the Second Division. Now, the First Division was under command of Otto von Dietrichs. And he was the commander in chief, Far East. He was the gentleman sent out there because Tirpitz had to be recalled. And that for him was great. But it's not really particularly great for the German Navy out there. It really isn't that particularly great for the German Navy out there. It's kind of a case of Otto von Dietrichs. Oh, he was an admiral in the Navy? Really? Yes. The Germans had managed to achieve a base and facility out there, but the fact that their flagship is the Deutschland, which had been built in 1874 and was universally considered something which was not exactly reliable. If I give you an example, the Gefion twice, when she was out there, not very long, had to go to the mechanical aid of the Deutschland and either give it a tow or render other assistance. It was an interesting vessel. What's more interesting is, though, who's sent out as second in command. Second in command, and the commander of the second division, which is what Gefion goes out in, is Prince Henry of Prussia, who lived 1862 to 1929. He is the brother of Kaiser Wilhelm II. There are many sad things in life that we can think about. One of them is that the order of the children was not reversed. Whereas Kaiser Wilhelm II is an impetuous egotist who thinks the world will automatically conform to his wishes and his view, Henry is not. Henry is a very decent admiral, and frankly, he was in many ways held back by his brother. You can see that by his postings and his naval career. He's Unterlieutenant zur See on the 14th of August 1872. Then he becomes Lieutenant zur See in October 1881. Captain Lieutenant in October 1884. Corvetti Capitan, October 1887. Captain zur See, January 1889. and he commanded the Irene, he commanded the Beowulf, he commanded the Sasson, and he commanded the Wolf. Contra Admiral, 1895. Weserl, 1889. Admiral, September 1901. Groh Admiral, September 1909. The fact is, he probably had his promotions held up by his brother in some regards. He is commander of the High Seas Fleet, 1906 to 09. He is Commander-in-Chief Baltic Fleet, 1914 to 1918. He is one of those admirals who even I forget when I'm talking about the German Navy, because he is a good admiral. Is he one of their best? Better than some who actually end up in more prominent positions. And partially this is politics, because if the brother of the king loses a battle, that could be horrifically damaging. So we can't have him there. But it also could be damaging if he wins a big battle. If he wins a big battle, that's damaging because people look at him and look at their own and their king and go, hang on, what have we got here? If you want to use a modern example, a really modern example, we might go look at Game of Thrones and discuss, Joffrey versus Tommen. Although I'm not really sure Tommen is anywhere near what Henry was capable of. But leave that to one side. So we are left with a scenario where the, on paper, surface raiding cruiser of the German Navy is sent out with, as part of a force, with other ships under the command of the Kaiser's own brother to reinforce the fleet in Kaichau Bay, what we would call Tsingtao or Qingdao. Yes, this is, of course, Germany's place in the Far East, their status, their critical claim to being a global power, having spaces around the world which you can paint red. Now, this is always the other problem for Germany and the other problem for everyone dealing with Germany. They're not satisfied with that. And Gefion's first really major international bit of duty comes not that long after she's deployed. Not that long after she's over there, because, well, see, what happens is in 1898, the Americans and the Spanish ended up having a dust-up. And this shows how weak the Spanish position is. And the Spanish have already been worried about the Germans in several places around the world, so they've been reinforcing when dealing with the Germans coming up. But now, their fleet's been massacred in Manila Bay. One of the first ships to turn up before almost the fighting subsided, before almost the smoke has settled and the dust is over and the bodies are buried and the wounded are taken to hospital, comes popping in Gefion. Because, well, Diedrichs sends her to investigate the situation in Manila. The hope was to either secure possessions in the Philippines, or best of all, to put a German prince on the Philippine throne outright. Sorry.
A German prince on a Philippine throne. Oh, and who is Dietrich's second in command? Oh, Prince Henry. Prince Henry is out there. Oh, Prince Heinrich. I keep calling him Henry. Sorry. Prince Heinrich is out there. In April 1899, Heinrich replaces Dietrich as the squadron commander. And again, Gefion has to go and assist the Deutschland, which had suffered engine damage. The thing was about Tsingtao and the Philippines, even if they got them, they still don't have the maintenance facilities for their ships out there. It's this little thing called infrastructure. You have to invest in it. It costs money. It takes time. It doesn't look sexy in an announcement in Parliament. We have built a dry dock. We have built a wharf. We have built a warehouse. But these things matter. We have built a barracks. We have built a hospital. Hospital in your own country. That sounds great. We have built a hospital for our sailors abroad in a foreign country. Why are we spending that money? Now, you could consider them very disappointed because they don't get anything of the Philippines. The Americans take it instead. Well, they've just won the battle for it. Seems only right they actually get it. They did the fighting. They should get the prize, shouldn't they? However, however, by about January 1900, we start to have issues with the Boxer Rebellion. And by May, the unrest which had started it started to appear in the Shandong Peninsula. Now, this, of course, was where the German base at Tsingtao was, and Tsingtao was a recent acquisition. After the rebellion, though, had started to break out, Gefion had joined the other navies and all the European ships under what the British refused to call the World Admiral. I know, the Germans send a general out to command the combined forces, land forces of them, and they are called the World Marshal. The British just call him Seymour. Edward Hobart Seymour, Vice Admiral. Hello, I'm in charge. These ships bombarded coastal defences southeast of Tianjin, and they even sent an expeditionary force ashore. And this was done in the Battle of Taku Forts. Geffen had landed a contingent under the command of Captain Lieutenant Otto Wenger. They participated in the storming of the great Heizhou Arsenal at Tianjin. By mid-July, Gefion is stationed outside of the Yangtze, monitoring traffic. And in November, she went to Hong Kong for an overhaul. Yes, the great enemy, the one who you're building up to challenge, is the one who you're currently depending upon for the infrastructure of being able to maintain your ships. Okay. After that, she went to Nagasaki and then. And the ship's commander was at one point sent to temporarily govern Tsingtao on behalf of the Earl Governor. And then she went to Shanghai, and then she went back home. Arriving there on the 1st of October 1901, and she's decommissioned in order to go for a major reconstruction. The work was done at the Kaiserlich Werft in Wilhelmshaven, and she emerges. New, more powerful electron generators, the upper decks enclosed, the 105 millimeter guns that have been located in the upper deck were moved to gun ports in the hull. The 50 millimeter guns that were located abreast of the center funnel were moved further aft to the third funnel. All this was lovingly done. However, even with all this work, in August 1914, when the Admiralty, the German Admiralty, the Admiralstar, ordered the Gefion to be reactivated, appointed Korvettenkapitän Weldwehr to command the ship, a crew couldn't be assembled due to shortages in personnel. So she was not placed back in service. Now, this is usually the point at which people go, well, they tried. They obviously wanted her because they tried. And I have to sit there and go, not really. Because, you see, here is the issue with that. If I want a ship in service and I am commanding tens of thousands of personnel, and it is a ship which takes a couple of hundred, I can find someone. I can find enough to put that ship to sea. If I have a use for it. If I don't have a use for it, I don't really want it. If I don't really want it, then I'm going to send those personnel to ships and places I do want them. Aren't I? I've got light cruisers. I've got far better vessels than this wandering around. Why do I want it? What use is it to me? It's bad enough I've got the Blucher, and I've got to supply that with personnel because of its name, because of its status. Why do I want the Gefion? And again, this is another thing of long-term investment in infrastructure. If you are going to invest in having ships stored in ordinary, in reserve, you've got to make sure you have the crews for them. And you've got to make sure they're going to be of use. What could this ship have provided in World War I? Let's think about that. 19.5 knots. Not fast enough to keep up with destroyers and support them. Might have been useful in the Baltic. Prince Heinrich, who I call Henry, but Prince Heinrich, might have found use for them. He's a good and clever admiral. But if he'd wanted it, considering his status, rank, and ability to get things done, he'd have had it. So that suggests he, who had been its commander already, didn't want it. Okay. Didn't want it for the Baltic. No one wants it for the North Sea. That's the trouble for an unprotected cruiser. Again, if this had been a British ship, it probably would have been activated. Why? Because the British could have used Gefion. There are literally millions of tons of shipping moving backwards and forwards every day around the world. Britain, especially prior to convoying things, was reliant upon cruisers being present everywhere, wandering up and down, hunting submarines, hunting surface raiders, being present. You activate everything. Which gets us back to the infrastructure and also to the necessary long-term thinking. There is no point building a ship you are not going to be able to use. If you are Germany in the 1890s, and you are building an unprotected cruiser to be a commerce raider, broadly speaking, what Gefion seems to be for, considering the range, etc., they factor in vis-a-vis and compared to their other ships. You need to think about its likely area of operations and what it's likely to do. If it's got to get past the British to get out into the Atlantic, it's going to need to be fast, a lot faster than 19 knots. And it's got to be longer range. If it's going to be operating against the French, that's a perfectly viable enemy. You're going to fight the Franco-Prussian War, enough, and all sorts of other funds. But if that's the case, then the ship needs to be built still with some of the ideas of how you get to the French commerce. And again, you're probably going to have to go around the UK. You might be naughty and try and sneak through the Irish Sea, but that's not going to cut that much off your journey, and that could be considered very naughty by the British, which might result in something nasty happening. So probably it's better not to. Cruisers are valuable assets. Cruisers are presence assets, they're capability assets. You invest time, you invest money, you invest people. This goes for the 19th century, this went for the 20th century, this goes for the 21st century. You invest in them. It goes for all warships. So you have to think through what you're building. So that leads us to today's question. I would like to hear from you of one ship or class of ships that you think nation did think through long term what they were building as they've been over. Gefion, the trouble is the scenario they're in. There isn't a good scenario for it to operate and provide its utility. And one ship or class which a nation didn't think through. And before anyone starts thinking, I can name British classes, I would argue that considering their role and life and duties, both the Type 23s and Type 45s were not thought through properly. Type 45s should have been completed with more VLS, and especially the Mark 41 VLS, so they did have the strike and general purpose capability. And the Type 23s should have been completed with, in my mind, a close-in weapons system. Probably a couple. And I'd like them all to have had a double 4.5-inch gun. But that's me. That's a personal preference, not big for a fault. So, one ship or class which was built with good long-term thinking, one ship or class which was built with bad long-term thinking. And I'd like to hear why, your reasonings for them. Thank you very much. Take care and have a nice day. Hope you enjoyed the series.